Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here as usual, kindly asking you to hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to quickly drop a comment saying where you're listening from, or heck, just saying that you're doing your part. It all helps out a ton. In December 1987, a respected Chicago professor vanished without a trace, leaving behind a scene of eerie clues that baffled investigators. Charles Southern Jr., a 39-year-old English professor who had become deeply involved in a cult, was supposed to depart for a 2-week trip, but he never even made his flight. Weeks later, when his concerned parents entered his home, they found a disturbing scene. His winter coat and hat were folded inside out on an African ceremonial stool, an act which was considered a symbol of departure. Further, there was a vial of curare poison hidden in a drawer, and 2 cryptic notes hinting at dark influences and final wishes. Charles himself was nowhere to be found. Charles Southern wasn't only a college professor, but also a seeker of higher spiritual meaning. He was a well-respected educator, yet he yearned for enlightenment beyond the classroom. His search for quote-unquote truth had already taken him to far-off places like India and Africa, and joining a New Age movement led by a self-proclaimed guru. In the mid-1980s, he became involved with something called Conscious Development of Body, Mind, and Soul, a spiritual group founded by Terry Hoffman. Immersed in this Dallas-based cult's teachings, Charles quickly rose to prominence. He even led meditation classes and study sessions for fellow members. Hoffman preached that invisible entities called Black Lords were constantly attacking her and her followers on a spiritual plane, and she implored her inner circle to help fight these evil forces. Living in perpetual fear of dark entities took a serious toll on the group's adherents and made them very pliable to the cult's leadership. By 1987, Charles began showing signs of extreme stress. He suffered a breakdown that summer and was found wandering the streets of Chicago incoherently, as if in a trance. Alarmed, his family admitted him to a hospital for a short psychiatric evaluation. Even during this recovery period, 2 conscious development members kept visiting him, an indication of how entangled he was with the group's influence. After his release, Charles continued to participate in Hoffman's meetings. However, friends observed that he had become disillusioned and was distancing himself from the cult's more intense activities. During the winter of 1987, Charles made plans to spend the Christmas holiday on a personal pilgrimage to India, a trip he hoped would be spiritually rejuvenating. In the days before his scheduled departure, his mother felt uneasy about him. She offered to come to Chicago to check on him, but Charles politely insisted he was all right. He admitted he wasn't feeling his best, yet assured her everything was under control and that he'd be leaving in just a few days. That phone call was the last contact anyone had with Charles. When he failed to return as expected and no one could reach him, his parents grew deeply concerned. Early in January 1988, his father drove from Cincinnati to Chicago to find out why Charles had gone silent. At Charles's home on West Rosemont Avenue, repeated knocks went unanswered. Fearing the worst, his parents eventually forced their way inside, where their nagging worry quickly turned to outright fear. It was immediately clear that Charles had never left on his trip at all, and his passport was found inside with no new stamps, proving he never embarked on the journey. What his parents discovered throughout the house next only deepened the nightmare. Inside the quiet home, several bizarre clues seemed to tell a dark story. In the living room, Charles's dress coat and hat were neatly folded inside out on a wooden stool from Nigeria. Only later would the family learn that this arrangement was a traditional Nigerian symbol of death, as if someone had performed a ritual to announce Charles's demise. In a bedroom drawer, they found a vial of an unknown substance resembling the poison curare. This is a rare toxin that can cause paralysis and is not something one would casually keep around. Finally, two handwritten notes were left behind on a table. Though barely legible, one note hinted that Charles had come under some bad influence that he was trying to fight off. The other appeared to be a last will, naming Terry Hoffman as the executor of his estate. This meant Charles had effectively put the leader of his cult in charge of all his affairs. There were no signs of physical violence or struggle anywhere on the property, but these unsettling items strongly suggested that his disappearance was the result of something sinister. With their son missing and only these cryptic remnants as evidence, Charles's distraught family alerted the authorities, and an intensive investigation began. Given the strange circumstances and the explicit reference to Terry Hoffman in Charles's final note, suspicion immediately fell on the cult leader. Hoffman steadfastly denied having any involvement in Charles's fate. However, detectives familiar with her organization were quick to point out an alarming pattern surrounding Hoffman. Over the preceding decade, a number of people in Terry Hoffman's orbit had died under unusual circumstances. These cases included two of Hoffman's own husbands, her only son, and at least 6 of her followers. In more than half of these instances, Hoffman turned out to be the beneficiary of the victim's life insurance policies, or was willed substantial assets like houses, cash, and jewelry. Charles Southern's disappearance fit this disturbing pattern. Here was a follower who had apparently drafted a will in Terry's favor and then vanished without explanation. Authorities in Texas had already been investigating Hoffman for possible undue influence over her followers. That said, building a criminal case was challenging with no concrete proof of foul play, and these individuals under her control were mentally competent adults. Ultimately, Terry Hoffman was never charged in connection with Charles's case or any of the suspicious deaths. The only legal repercussions she faced were unrelated. In 1994, Hoffman was convicted of bankruptcy fraud and served 16 months in prison. Ironically, she later wrote a book on spiritually based personal finance under a pseudonym where she taught readers how to tap into their, quote, money force. She continued to maintain her innocence regarding the incidents surrounding her and lived freely until her own death in 2015 at age 77. Almost 40 years have now passed since Charles Southern vanished, and his fate is still just as unknown today as it was back then. Some who follow the case wonder if Charles had another mental breakdown and simply walked away from his life. Others speculate that he ended it on his own terms, given his fragile psychological state in the months prior. However, many others firmly believe he met a darker end orchestrated by someone within the cult. Whatever the case, it seems clear to me that Terry Hoffman took advantage of someone who was in a bad state mentally and then fed the paranoia. That said, I tend to believe that Charles would have been much more likely to stage the scene in the way it was done up, rather than one of the cultists. On a warm August evening in 2010, 30-year-old Ben McDaniel slipped into the clear waters of Vortex Spring in Florida for a solo cave dive. As dusk fell, he swam toward a submerged passage blocked by a metal grate, passing a Grim Reaper sign that cautioned divers nothing beyond was worth dying for. Despite lacking cave diving certification, Ben pushed past the gate into the cave's depths. He never returned to the surface. Extensive searches of the underwater labyrinth found no trace of him, and even 15 years later, his fate remains unknown. Ben McDaniel loved scuba diving from a young age, but by his late 20s, a string of personal setbacks had upended his life. Ben grew up in Tennessee, where he started diving as a teenager and even ran a successful construction business for a time. But in the late 2000s, he endured a painful divorce and the collapse of that business, which left him with tens of thousands of dollars in debt to the IRS. Worse, In 2008, his younger brother died suddenly at age 22, a tragedy that devastated Ben and left him grief-stricken. In 2010, hoping to help him heal, Ben's parents invited him to take an extended break at their beach house on the Florida Panhandle. Ben relocated to Santa Rosa Beach with his dog and soon became a regular at Vortex Spring, a popular freshwater dive site about an hour away. Immersing himself in daily dives, he told friends he was mapping the spring's underwater cave system and working toward becoming a certified dive instructor. Although he didn't have the required certification to go into the caves, Ben reportedly pushed the limits by exploring the Vortex Spring Cave whenever he could. On August 18, 2010, Ben spent much of the day scuba diving at Vortex Spring and updating his dive log with observations. That evening, he spoke by phone with his mom, then geared up for one last dive just before sunset. As Ben descended into the spring, two employees noticed him heading toward the cave entrance. They knew Ben as an avid visitor and suspected he was intent on venturing into the off-limits section of the cave. In fact, one of the employees later admitted he thought Ben had been trying to bypass the locked gate inside the cave, so he used his own key to unlock it for Ben. With the gate open, Ben swam into the winding tunnels beyond the warning signs, undeterred by the danger. When Ben failed to resurface later that night, no one on shore immediately realized something was wrong. Vortex Spring is a busy spot, and his pickup truck remained parked unnoticed for 2 days, with no one apparently noticing it. On August 20th, employees finally grew alarmed that Ben's truck hadn't moved and called the Holmes County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived and treated the area as a potential accident scene, even roping it off with police tape while rescue divers were called in. Ben's wallet, cell phone, and detailed dive logs were found in his truck, along with a hand-drawn map of the cave system he'd been exploring. An intensive search and recovery effort began. Veteran cave divers from across the region converged on Vortex Spring, fully aware of its reputation. Notably, over a dozen divers had lost their lives in this cave in prior years. The cave's layout is complex and perilous. The entrance is 50 feet underwater, and beyond the unlocked gate, the passages narrow to squeezes as small as 10 inches high. Despite those challenges, teams of experts methodically scoured all accessible areas. Early in the search, they found 2 of Ben's decompression tanks just inside the cave entrance. He had left them there for his return trip, a normal practice, but oddly, the tanks were filled only with regular air instead of a specialized gas mix. Apart from those tanks, divers discovered nothing else that belonged to Ben. They pushed into every crevice they could reach, but came up empty. No body, no additional gear, not even a scrape mark on the cave walls or any disturbed silt. Searchers also pointed out that at 6 feet 1 inch tall and around 210 pounds, Ben's build would have made it nearly impossible for him to navigate portions of the cave. The McDaniel family even funded advanced search measures. A remotely operated submarine was sent into passages too narrow for humans, and the water was tested for any evidence of human decomposition. Interestingly, all these signs came up negative, suggesting the possibility that Ben hadn't perished in the cave at all. As months and years passed with no answers, several theories emerged to explain Ben McDaniel's fate. His parents put up a large financial reward for anyone who was able to recover his body, but unfortunately this led to another tragedy. A diver who had come from Mississippi to claim the bounty perished while he was searching for Ben's remains. This led to Ben's parents to withdraw the reward money and urge that no further attempts be undertaken. Ben's parents and many divers believe he drowned in an unmapped, unreachable section of the cave, effectively hiding his remains. Some even suggest his body could be slowly entombed by sand and silt, further concealing Ben's body, though this doesn't explain why no evidence of decomposition was found. Others speculate that he staged his own disappearance to escape financial, marital, and personal troubles, or may have fallen victim to foul play. By 2013, with no breakthroughs, Florida issued a death certificate declaring Ben McDaniel legally dead. It's 1939 in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Winter has come early to the far tip of Cape Cod, and the town is on edge. The Great Depression still has its grip, and locals whisper about German U-boats off the coast ready to follow and strike British and French vessels. But the 4,500 year-round residents aren't afraid of the conflict yet. It's 1939, and America's still neutral. They're afraid of something else, something that bounds down the dark alleyways off Commercial Street, laughing. It's 8 feet tall, wears a black cloak, and has glowing silver eyes. History would know it as the Black Flash of Provincetown. Provincetown's isolation at the tip of Cape Cod created a unique social environment. Once the summer crowds left, the remaining residents were left with little to do for the winter. This was a condition that the local Provincetown Advocate newspaper openly dubbed cabin fever, a period known for breeding wild yarns and spooky folk tales. The Black Flash was one of these yarns, but it was an old one. The Panic of 1939 wasn't its debut. According to a Boston Globe report, stories of the Flash had circulated in the fall for the past 8 years. One old sea captain even claimed it appeared every 4th year. However, there was one problem. The only people who saw this figure were kids, which led to the belief that they were just making it up. When the adults finally did start to see the Black Flash, the descriptions from witnesses painted a frightening image. The creature was consistently described as inhumanly tall, ranging from 7 to nearly 8 feet. It was gaunt, fast, and always wearing a long, hooded black cape. The face, however, was a point of contradiction. Some reports mentioned a metal mask, while others described it with glowing eyes and cat-like ears. Its abilities were what made it supernatural. It earned its name, the Flash, from its ability to appear out of nowhere. Its defining characteristic, however, was its impossible leap, clearing tall fences in a single bound. As the hysteria grew, so did the entity's boldness, and it was accused of directly assaulting people and shooting blue flames from its mouth. Notably, if this creature sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you've heard of the famous 19th century British legend, Spring-Heeled Jack. While the Flash's appearance is slightly different, the activity it engaged in is largely the same. The confirmed Black Flash sighting suddenly stopped appearing in November 1939, just as quickly as it appeared. Around the same time, the police chief released a statement saying that the Black Flash is gone, and that he knew who the perpetrators were. He stated that they wouldn't do it again, but he avoided mentioning their names, since he didn't want to embarrass them for their activities. Privately, he later revealed that he believed it was a group of teenagers playing a trick, with the Black Flash entity being 2 of these troublemakers. One would sit on the other's shoulders, while the others would terrorize the victims of the prank with bizarre noises or flashes. Notably, the oral history of the tale continued into the 1940s, with some reports claiming the phantom lingered until 1945. Whether this was an extension of the mass hysteria, or whether other pranksters took up the mantle of the Black Flash, remains unknown. Today, the Black Flash is a local celebrity and a staple of Provincetown's haunted tourism industry, featured prominently on ghost tours. The legend has completed its full cycle. It began as a cabin fever story and escalated into a genuine social phenomenon that served as a pressure valve for a town's anxieties. It was then rationalized as a prank by local teenagers before being resurrected as a bone-chilling commercial asset. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just giving you another gentle reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also, if you're feeling generous and you've got the means to comfortably do it, consider dropping a one-time tip or supporting through the YouTube membership or Patreon. The question of when the ancient Greeks started worshiping the 12 Olympians seems simple, but the answer is a fascinating, multi-layered story that unfolds over 1,000 years. It reveals that while the gods themselves are ancient, their famous Club of 12 is a surprisingly late invention. The historical consensus, pieced together from archaeology, linguistics, and literature, presents us with two distinct timelines. The first tracks the worship of individual gods who would later be called Olympians, and it takes us deep into the Bronze Age. The second, much shorter timeline marks the moment these deities were first venerated together as a specific, canonical group of 12. Our journey begins around 1400 BC with the Mycenaeans, the first Greek-speaking civilization. For decades, our knowledge of them was limited to their mighty citadels and Homer's epic tales. But the decipherment of their script, Linear B, in the 1950s was a revelation. On these tablets, among inventories of chariots and personnel, were the names of gods receiving offerings. These tablets contain precursor gods to Zeus, Hera, Athena, Hermes, Ares, and Dionysus, the latter of whom was once thought to be a late import to Greece. This is proof that worship of these individual deities was a serious, state-sponsored enterprise centuries before they were ever imagined residing together on Mount Olympus. What's more, this early pantheon wasn't a mirror image of its later classical form. The divine hierarchy was different. At one location, Zeus wasn't the chief god, but Poseidon. And he wasn't just the lord of the sea, he was a far more primal entity. Poseidon was known as the Earthshaker, and it's believed that ancient Greeks also thought he was responsible for earthquakes. This tells us that the relationships between the gods were fluid, their prominence varying by time and place. Zeus's undisputed reign wasn't a given. It was a position he would have to win in the religious imagination of the Greeks over the following centuries. This religious system was itself a hybrid, born from the encounter between the incoming Indo-European Greeks and the pre-existing Minoan civilization on Crete. When the Mycenaean palaces collapsed around 1100 BC, this centralized, bureaucratic world vanished, plunging Greece into a dark age. The art of writing was lost, but the gods were not. Their cult survived, albeit in a more localized and fragmented form. This period of transformation was crucial, for it was out of this cultural reset that the foundations for a unified or Pan-Hellenic Greek identity were laid. Two forces were instrumental in this process. The first was literary. Around the 8th century BC, the poets Homer and Hesiod emerged. They didn't invent the gods, but they organized them. Hesiod's Theogony provided a definitive family tree, narrating the gods' origins and their war against the Titans. This gave the ultimate triumph that established Zeus as the undisputed king of the gods. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey gave the gods the distinct, flawed, and all too human personalities we recognize today. These epics, recited at festivals across the Greek-speaking world, created a shared mythology, a common religious language that transcended local differences. The second force was the rise of great Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. At Olympia, a site with religious activity stretching back into the Bronze Age, the Olympic Games were established in 776 BC to honor Zeus, making it the center of his worship. At Delphi, a sanctuary was dedicated to Apollo around 800 BC, and this site became home to the most powerful oracle in the ancient world. These sites became centers of a common faith. physical places where the myths codified by the poets were monumentalized in stone and celebrated by all Greeks. The myths gave meaning to the sanctuaries, and the sanctuaries lent authority to the myths. Yet, even with this growing Panhellenism, there was still no formal concept of the 12. That final step came relatively late. The first concrete evidence for a cult of the 12 appears in Athens around 522 BC. This was with the establishment of the Altar of the 12 Gods in the city's central agora. This act, likely a political move by the ruling class, created a civic and religious focal point for the developing city-state. The number 12 itself was deeply symbolic, echoing cosmic order, the months of the year, the signs of the zodiac, and suggesting a complete and balanced pantheon. But this group was never perfectly rigid, and the list of members could vary, with Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, often being swapped out for the more dynamic Dionysus. For reasons that should resonate with modern audiences, Dionysus was a fan favorite amongst the gods even back then. The answer to when the Greeks started to worship the 12 is a tale of two beginnings. They began worshiping the individual gods we call Olympians in the Bronze Age, with clear evidence by 1400 BC. But they only began worshiping them as a formal collective group known as the 12 nearly 1,000 years later, in the late 6th century BC. Still, this is simply as far as the evidence takes us at present, and it's possible that in the future we will find further evidence to indicate the worship of the 12 Olympians is even older. It was a scene that could have been pulled from a heist thriller. On the evening of May 25, 2003, as dusk settled over Quatro de Fevereiro International Airport in Luanda, Angola, a large Boeing 727 airliner unexpectedly began lumbering down the runway. There were no lights on the aircraft and no communication with the control tower. Air traffic controllers watched in disbelief as the unregistered jet picked up speed. Without clearance, it roared into the air and banked toward the southwest, vanishing into the twilight over the Atlantic Ocean. In the cockpit, by most accounts, were two men, an American aviation engineer and a Congolese mechanic, neither of whom was fully qualified to fly that plane. The Boeing 727 and the men on board have never been seen again. The aircraft at the center of this mystery was a Boeing 727-223 model, a three-engine jetliner built in 1975. For 25 years, it flew passengers across the United States as part of the American Airlines fleet. By 2001, the aging 727 was retired from commercial service. A Miami-based company called Aerospace Sales and Leasing, led by businessman Maury Joseph, acquired the plane, seeing opportunity in its remaining value. The jet, still bearing its faded American Airlines livery of unpolished silver skin with blue, white, and red stripes, was reconfigured for a new life. All the passenger seats were stripped out of its cabin, and it was outfitted with large fuel tanks, essentially converting it into a flying fuel tanker. The plan was to use the 727 to ferry diesel fuel to remote diamond mining operations in Angola, a country where ground transport was perilous after decades of civil war. In early 2002, the Boeing 727, now identified by its tail number N844AA, was flown from the United States to Africa. A South African entrepreneur named Keith Irwin had leased the aircraft from Joseph's company for the fuel delivery venture. He assembled a crew and installed 10 collapsible fuel tanks inside the plane's fuselage. The jet departed Miami at the end of February 2002 and arrived in Luanda, Angola in mid-March after delays. However, upon arrival, the business deal began to unravel. The Angolan client failed to pay the promised funds, leaving the crew stranded and the aircraft stuck on the airport tarmac. Over the next weeks, tensions grew, and the foreign flight crew faced harsh living conditions and even feared for their safety amid the turbulent environment. Disputes escalated to the point where some crew members quietly plotted to fly the 727 out of Angola on their own to escape the situation. Only intervention by the U.S. Embassy resolved the standoff, allowing the crew to recover their passports and leave the country. One by one, the disheartened pilots and engineers returned home, and by mid-2002, the hastily conceived fuel hauling operation had collapsed. What remained was the airplane itself, abandoned at Luanda's airport with no flight crew and mounting debts. The once proud jetliner sat idle for over a year, one of a couple of derelict planes at the field. During those 14 months of inactivity, it accrued an eye-watering sum of over $4 million in parking fees and other charges. Weather and lack of maintenance took a toll on the 727's condition. By late 2002, its future was uncertain. The aircraft was essentially a hostage to unpaid bills and a failed venture. Maury Joseph, the owner, still had a stake in the plane and its valuable engines, and he wasn't ready to write it off. Joseph negotiated with authorities and sought a solution to either get the jet flying again or at least recoup his losses by selling its parts. By spring 2003, he had arranged for the 727 to be repaired, refueled, and flown out of Angola to be delivered to a new customer in South Africa. To carry out this plan, Joseph turned to a trusted contractor, an American man named Ben Padilla, to oversee the refurbishment and retrieval of the aircraft. Ben Padilla was the main figure on the ground in Angola, working to reclaim the 727. Padilla was a 50-year-old aircraft mechanic and certified flight engineer from Florida. He was no stranger to aviation challenges. He had years of experience maintaining and ferrying airplanes, including working in various African countries. Though Padilla had a private pilot's license, he wasn't qualified to fly a large jet airliner like the Boeing 727 as a captain. Still, he was resourceful and knowledgeable about this specific plane, and he had been involved with it during previous jobs for Maury Joseph. In April 2003, Padilla arrived in Luanda as Joseph's agent. His mission was to pay off the outstanding fees, hire local technicians, and restore the long-neglected 727 to airworthiness. By all accounts, Padilla threw himself into the task. He coordinated with an Angolan maintenance firm and even arranged to hire a crew from a local airline, including a qualified pilot and co-pilot, to fly the jet out once it was ready. Padilla's family later described him as a man who would not have casually risked flying that big jet alone. Simply put, they didn't believe he was a big risk taker. They believe he must have been swept up in events beyond his control. Alongside Padilla was John Michael Mutantu, a mechanic from the Republic of the Congo. Mutantu had been hired recently to assist Padilla with the repairs. Little is publicly known about Mutantu's background. He was essentially a contract worker brought in for his technical skills. What is known, though, is that he wasn't a pilot at all, but a mechanic helping to get the Boeing ready for its ferry flight. Mutantu and Padilla worked together in those final weeks of May 2003, replacing parts, testing systems, and fueling the jet for its much-anticipated departure. These two men would ultimately become the central characters in the plane's disappearance, as they were the ones last seen aboard the aircraft before it vanished. Neither Padilla nor Mutantu has been heard from since the day of the disappearance. Another key player in this saga is Maury Joseph, the owner of the aircraft. Joseph was not on site in Angola at the time of the disappearance, but he had orchestrated the effort to recover the plane. A businessman based in Miami, Joseph had what some have alleged to be a slightly checkered history in the aviation leasing world. However, other sources indicate that none of his business practices were out of the ordinary for high-risk airplane leasing. He wasn't in Angola at the time of the disappearance. Instead, he was awaiting the jet's delivery to a buyer in South Africa. On the day the plane went missing, Joseph was in Johannesburg, expecting to greet his crew and client. Little did he know what would happen next. By late May 2003, the Boeing 727 was finally in taxiing condition after extensive repairs. Padilla had settled many of the airport fines using funds from the owner, and the plan was to fly the aircraft out within days. On the afternoon of Sunday, May 25th, Padilla made arrangements for a final test. He intended to taxi the 727 to the main runway and perform a high-power engine run-up, a common procedure to check the systems under load. That evening, as the golden light of sunset tinged the airport, the 727 indeed began to move. But what happened next was anything but a routine test. Shortly before 5 p.m. local time, to the surprise of ground staff, the Boeing 727 suddenly powered up and started rolling toward the runway. Ben Padilla and John Mutantu had been seen boarding the aircraft moments before. No other qualified pilot was with them, and crucially, the two had no clearance to take off. An airport employee later reported seeing only one person in the cockpit, but others were certain both men had climbed aboard. The control tower tried frantically to hail the 727 on the radio, but there was only silence. The big jetliner swung erratically into position on the runway. Its landing lights were switched off, and its transponder, the device that identifies an aircraft on radar, was not transmitting. Essentially, the aircraft had gone both dark and rogue on the airfield. Ground personnel could only watch as the 727 barreled down the runway. Gaining speed, it lifted off into the evening sky without permission. Tower controllers kept calling out to the plane with no response. The jet turned southwest, heading out over the Atlantic Ocean, and within minutes it disappeared from Luanda's radar. Just like that, the massive plane was gone. It carried with it the two men, and also an enormous quantity of fuel. The aircraft's tanks had been topped up with 14,000 gallons of fuel, enough for roughly 1,500 miles of flight. This fuel would allow it to reach many destinations across Africa. As darkness fell, no one knew whether the aircraft was flying steadily toward some clandestine landing spot, or if it was in trouble and about to crash into the sea. The airport authorities in Luanda were in disbelief and alarm. They had a missing airliner on their hands, one that had essentially been stolen in plain sight. Immediate attempts to locate or contact the aircraft were fruitless. In neighboring countries, air traffic monitors were asked if they had any unidentified blips on their radar screens, but none did. The 727 seemed to have vanished into thin air. Back in Johannesburg, owner Maury Joseph was expecting the plane's arrival the next day. Instead, he got the call that every owner of a commercial airliner dreads. His plane was stolen from the runway. And honestly, I wrote that line without thinking about how absurd it sounds. And yes, I decided it was too good and silly not to keep it in. An Angolan aviation official demanded to know why Joseph's plane had left with an unauthorized crew and under such weird circumstances. Joseph quickly called the U.S. Embassy and his contacts to report that his airplane had been stolen. And it's important to remember that this happened very soon after the events of 2001, so the world immediately went on highest alert. The disappearance of the Boeing from Angola triggered a global investigation and a whirlwind of speculation. In the hours and days after the plane went missing, American authorities, including the FBI, CIA, and State Department, worked alongside international agencies to track down any trace of the jet. If someone intended to use this plane as a weapon or for illegal activities, the clock was ticking. Intelligence analysts scanned satellite images for signs of a crash, perhaps an oil slick on the ocean or scorched earth in the African bush. Military surveillance teams considered the possibility of intercepting the rogue aircraft if it appeared on any radar. For a time, U.S. officials even contemplated moving fighter jets into positions in Africa, ready to respond if the 727 was spotted threatening any strategic targets. In those tense initial hours and days, it was as if a ghost plane was haunting the authorities' imaginations. Despite the intense search, no definitive sightings or wreckage were found. False leads cropped up. At one point, rumors suggested the aircraft might have crashed off the coast, or that it landed at an abandoned strip somewhere in Central Africa. In July 2003, about a month after the disappearance, a tantalizing report emerged from West Africa. A veteran pilot claimed to have spotted a mysteriously familiar Boeing 727 at an airport in Conakry, Guinea. The plane he saw had a new paint job and a Guinean registration number, but faintly visible on its tail were the telltale letters AA, the same last letters of the U.S. registration. This eyewitness was convinced it was the missing Angola 727, potentially being used to covertly haul cargo. The report caused a stir, but when U.S. officials investigated further, they concluded it was a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps even a hoax. The Guinean plane, they said, wasn't the stolen jet after all, and hope of an easy answer evaporated. With an enduring mystery and no hard facts, various theories have taken root over the years. One of the simplest explanations is a tragic accident. The Boeing 727 was a complex aircraft requiring 3 trained crew members to fly safely. On that evening, it likely had just Ben Padilla at the controls, a man who, while experienced with aircraft, was not certified to fly a 727. John Mutantu, the mechanic, would have been of little to no help in the cockpit given his skill set. It's entirely possible that once airborne, the makeshift crew found the jetliner too much plane to handle. A mispiloted turn, an instrument mix-up, or an in-flight emergency could have led the plane to crash into the Atlantic Ocean not long after takeoff, before anyone could even report a sighting. If the 727 plunged into deep tropical waters, heavy with fuel, it might have sunk almost intact, leaving little to no debris for searchers to find. Padilla's own family leans toward this theory. They fear that he died in a crash after getting the plane off the ground, perhaps heroically trying to save it from disaster until the last moment. Another possibility is that the plane did not crash at all, but was stolen for clandestine purposes. Could Ben or John themselves have been in on such a heist, or were they overpowered by others? Some have speculated that a third person might have snuck on board the 727, or that Padilla and Mutantu were forced to fly the aircraft to a secret location. The plane had enough fuel to fly about 4 to 5 hours, putting a vast radius of remote Africa within reach. Conceivably, the jet could have headed inland and landed on an isolated airstrip in a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo or elsewhere, far from prying eyes. A 727 alongside someone who could fly it, and a mechanic, could be extremely useful to a warlord or a criminal cartel. Under this theory, after the chaotic takeoff, the aircraft might have been flown to a prearranged hiding spot, its exterior quickly repainted and identity changed. It could have been stashed in a hangar or camouflaged at a remote airfield. Even today it might be out there somewhere, quietly rusting away or continuing to operate under a false identity. This idea sounds like the plot of a movie, but it's a scenario investigators considered seriously for a time. In the absence of answers, the fate of the Angola Boeing has remained one of aviation's great unsolved mysteries. The FBI formally closed its case in 2005, having turned up no leads that could definitively explain what happened.